Hey, this is Vu, and this is going to be a video that's a little bit more beginner focused. It's going to be 10 things I wish I knew when I started playing CSGO. Before we go any further, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Leadify. Leadify is an AI coach that allows you to improve faster by analyzing your Faceit or matchmaking games and giving you insight into your weaknesses as well as personalized training. Leadify has also implemented a team finder area on their website that will match you based on your skill level, schedule, and ambition, so you can find like-minded players outside of my YouTube comments. Whether you're beginner, intermediate, advanced, or you're a professional player watching my videos trying to be as good as me, Leadify is the app for you. It's also free to use, so give a click to the link in the description and head on over to leadify.com. And the first one is going to be something that I think is very important to understand, is when you're rifling, don't play angles your opponents are fully expecting you to be at unless you have some sort of an advantage. The type of angle that doesn't have an advantage would be like this angle here towards car. If I'm posted up here with a rifle, while I do know where my opponents are coming, they are also going to be hard clearing me because it's an incredibly common angle, and I don't have any outside advantage to give me a real leg up. So instead of playing that type of angle with a rifle, this is more of an op angle, but it's just an example. You know, a headshot angle over here makes more sense because you have a bit of an advantage in some way, or an off angle, like exactly like this angle here, where you're instead of holding this angle where your opponents are going to peek out looking right at you, you play the off angle where your opponents are out here by the time they see you, which means they're very likely to be looking somewhere like long corner instead of directly at you. Now, of course, some of the things in this list are going to be more metagame and more specific to the way you're learning the game, and some of them are going to be more specific to exactly how you're playing the game. And one of the more meta ones is going to be not to copy exactly what pros are doing. There's a lot of things that pros do specifically that are hard to pick up on that don't necessarily apply to every scenario, or they perhaps don't necessarily apply to situations where you don't have teammates throwing supporting utility, or they might even just be straight up counter strats. Now, it's not that you don't want to learn from professional players, however, make sure you're careful in what you're picking up, and you're not just trying to copy word for word as if you're trying to cheat on their test. Instead, pick up small things from what they're doing, angles they like to hold, or small rotations they like to make, and then test those out yourself and see if they work for you. Understand, even if an angle is being held by a professional player, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be one that you are currently capable of holding. So test it out and be willing to not take an angle maybe that Kenny S is playing because you're not quite Kenny S yet. And of course, speaking of Kenny S, one of the most common things for players at lower or mid levels really is they over-rely oftentimes on CT side, and this actually ties into the first note as well. When you don't understand which engagements you should be taking with a rifle, you don't actually have to learn that if instead you just play with an op where you can hold any angle as long as you don't get blind, right? With rifles, you have to be a little bit more selective. You have to play, again, angles where you have a slight advantage at the very least, or off angles, and you have to rely on your ability to actually aim, because sometimes even if you have an advantage when you take an engagement, if you miss or if you just can't spray them down, you're going to get killed. And that's not to say that you shouldn't ever op. However, oftentimes the op ends up being a bit of a crutch for new players on the CT side, where you never have to learn the intricacies of the game. You can just post up, and your opponents, because they're also new to the game, don't understand how to use utility to push you off of angles and actually make you very uncomfortable. So try to make sure that you're at least competent with rifles and you don't only op on that CT side. The next is something I've talked about a few times before in other videos. However, it's still important to keep in mind, and it's certainly something beginners should be keeping in mind specifically, is just because something works once doesn't mean that you should be doing it, and just because something fails once doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. You do need a little bit more information as to whether or not a play is good, other than just one attempt at the play and one result from the play. Make sure you're constantly evaluating that, and make sure you don't instantly conclude a play is not good just because it went wrong once. CS is a game of percentages. A good play isn't a play that works every time, time and never fails, a good play is probably a play that works 70% of the time. So there's still a lot of error there potentially that you need to be able to work through, and you need to be able to analyze that correctly. This falls into the next bit that I've actually seen a couple of people talking about recently is don't fall into a constant habit and never reevaluate. There's something that happens sometimes, and especially in FPS games, where there develops somewhat meta games in certain ranks. And what that means is certain ranks might play in a certain way, and you can counter them in a specific way. For example, maybe a certain rank never opts B apartments, and so you can very easily walk into this angle and never get killed, and you can take engagements perhaps that you wouldn't otherwise. Or even outside of metagaming, you might be in a rank where you can easily out-aim your opponents, and thereby you can take engagements and make peaks that you otherwise probably shouldn't. Now, it's not that you don't want to do that at all in that rank. Of course, it would be better to play correctly. However, that's not always easy to discern, especially if you're not really experienced, what is correct and what is metagame. The main thing you want to make sure you're doing to avoid all of that, if possible, is simply be constantly willing to reevaluate your gameplay and plays you're making. Just because it was working for you for a few days last week doesn't mean you should put it in the great play category and never move it out. Make sure you're constantly questioning if your play is consistently working enough that you should be doing it. Of course, again, you're going to need to play many games and try things out multiple times to know. Don't get too stuck on one thing that was working for you in a certain rank when you end up ranking up or, well, ranking down. And the next one is something that I think a lot of people need to hear if they haven't been watching my videos where I shout this from the mountaintops. It's the idea that movement and crosshair placement are more important than your aim, especially against lower level players who are very often going to be sitting in, as I said earlier, locations where you are going to peek directly into them holding angles they shouldn't really be holding because they don't have an advantage. Against that type of player, you don't actually need to move your crosshair all that much a lot of the time. If you're peeking out into someone, you can have your crosshair directly on them, you can strafe out, stop, and then simply shoot without even moving your crosshair other than recoil control and get a large number of kills. It's actually surprising how often you can kill people without really needing almost any aim if your crosshair placement and movement are on point. So keep those things in mind. Don't just mindlessly train your aim, and by aim I mean your point click aim, and then go into game and wonder why you do so well in deathmatch but do so poorly in real games. It's probably because your movement and crosshair placement are whack. Now, I would say easily the most important thing I would want to know when I first started CS is to invest in skins when they launch. If I could have learned that back in the day, I would be rich right now. Anyways, you also want to make sure that you understand you're not going to get good overnight. If you want to be global elite or professional someday, you need to understand that every day is the slow path to improvement. As long as you're better at the end of the day than when you started the day, that's all that matters. Eventually, if you close your eyes, you'll end up global elite just by playing consistently, not worrying about your rank, trying to make sure you're getting a little bit better every time. So the final one I'm going to actually take a look at here is to make sure you're playing a variety of different positions and spots on different maps. So we've got Inferno here, and you might become extremely proficient at something like Banana. You might end up learning all of the utility there, and you play Banana on both sides. And I actually highly recommend doing that, where you play T side defaults in one spot, and CT side you play the same spot, because you learn both sides of it so you can play against it. But that doesn't mean you should do that forever. You could become very good at controlling Banana, but there is also going to be benefit to becoming good at apartments or becoming good at middle and making sure that you understand the way those spots are played as well. Not necessarily because you want to play there. You don't need to be as good as your main position even, but being able to understand those spots and play them to a proficient level over time will make you a better player overall, because certain spots on certain maps prioritize certain skills. For example, again, Banana here on Inferno, really huge on utility usage and when and where where you're going to be using your nades. However, you know, while it's still true towards arches or towards brackets here, this does rely a little bit more on aim and a little bit more on rotations, and this is the type of thing that you want to learn over time. As well, there's different subsets of spots. You know, you might be a sight anchor if you're the player that plays sight side on B. You might be the rotator if you're towards CT or you're towards arch here, and these spots require different skills. You have to try all of them before you know which one you're best at, and then you can, you know, lean a little bit more towards it. But still, knowing all of the roles is going to be valuable in terms of actually improving over time. Anyways, the final one I'm going to leave you with here is that Dust 2 sucks. Don't play it. Play all the maps. Don't only play one map, for the love of God. Dust 2 sucks. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, sub to the channel, check out some of my other videos, and if you really liked it, you can head on over to if you really liked it, you can head on over to my Patreon, patreon.com/VooCSGO, for extra content and demo reviews.